So the textbook derives this concept using this kind of discrete demand curve where since you're just jumping by whole numbers, you get this kind of step curve going on here. I'm going to jump right into our standard looking demand curve. But by doing that, I'm really assuming that you can change by very small amounts here. So if it's helpful, you could think of this as instead of the first unit, the 100th unit, and then you can make very small changes, kind of fills in all the gaps here. But since I am going to talk about just the first unit, second unit, and so on, we're really allowing for fractional units. So we're allowing for very small changes along this curve, and we really should be starting from the very first fractional unit up here. If I wanted to be complete, it's not really necessary to do that, so I'm just going to be starting at the first unit. But we are assuming we can make these very tiny changes if we're going to draw a smooth demand curve like this. So up until now, we've been looking at the demand curve in terms of you give me a price and I can tell you quantity demanded from the demand curve. So here, price of 20, the quantity demanded is 1. So remember our example where I just surveyed a bunch of people, what's your willingness to pay? So at 20, one person is willing to pay. And so if I drop the price to something else, let's say 18, whatever quantity this is, that's new quantity demanded. So here at a price of 10, 6 people want to buy it. So now we're just kind of coming at it from the other direction. So now I'm going to say at a quantity of 1, what is the willingness to pay at that quantity? So I'm going up to my demand curve at a price of 20. So the height of my demand curve, and now the willingness to pay for the 6th unit. So just the 6th unit, not the total of 6 units. But just at the 6th unit, someone is willing to pay $10 for that 6th unit. So that's what the height of our demand curve is showing us. So willingness to pay, another way of saying that is the marginal benefit of this good. In other words, the benefit that someone is getting in dollar terms. If you're willing to pay $20 for this first unit, then we would say that's the amount of benefit in dollar terms that you're getting. Now the term marginal is very important because we're going to see this over and over again. This just means the last unit or the additional unit. And when we are looking at a smooth continuous curve like this, then the difference between the next unit and the last unit, there's really no difference, because since we're allowing for such minuscule changes here, if I say so the marginal benefit at 1 is 20, and so does that mean the next unit after 1 or the first unit coming from this direction? If we have a curve like this, it's not really going to matter because we're making very tiny changes. If we're using that discrete demand curve, then it might matter because then you're getting these jumps to the next unit. So marginal is just the benefit of just the last unit. So at that unit number 1 or here, just that 6th unit, not the total of 6 units, but just after the 5th unit, then you have the 6th unit and then the 7th unit. And again, if we're making small changes, then next and last is basically going to be the same thing here. So we're just saying that at the 6th unit, the willingness to pay is 10. So just for that unit, someone is willing to pay 10. So it could be a bunch of people making up this demand curve where one particular person has this very high willingness to pay of 20 and someone else comes in at a quantity of 6 and has this willingness to pay of 10. It could also be an individual person's demand curve. So if this is something that I'm buying a lot of units, that first unit I'm willing to pay 20, the second unit I'm willing to pay a little bit less, and the third a little bit less, and then the 6th unit I'm willing to pay 10, and so on. So usually we're dealing with a market demand curve where we could imagine a bunch of people making this up, but it wouldn't really matter. So marginal benefit is just that willingness to pay for that last unit that we're talking about, the height of your demand curve. So it's sometimes called marginal value. Usually we'll use the term marginal benefit. So your demand curve is really a marginal benefit curve. And we'll see this crop up again later on. So we can keep going. Like I said, for the second unit, your willingness to pay is going to be a little bit lower. So usually we're assuming that this is diminishing, it's downward sloping demand curve. So the third unit's going to be someone is going to be willing to pay a little bit less for that third unit. So it just kind of ranked in terms of who gets the most benefit out of that next unit. And we can just keep going. So again, the entire height of the demand curve is that marginal benefit. So someone gets a marginal benefit of $18 for that second unit. And now in my example here, I'm just assuming that the price is $10. So this is the equilibrium price for this market. So the price is 10. Now notice someone is willing to pay 20 and the price is 10. So that difference is like the net gain that they get from buying this good. So this person is going to be able to buy this at the market price. Doesn't matter what their willingness to pay is if the market price is $10. and we're not allowing for different prices for different people. We will see that later on. But so if I'm willing to pay 20 and I pay 10, then that $10 is my net gain. We call that consumer surplus. So the difference between willingness to pay, which is the height of your demand curve, that's also marginal benefit, minus the price, the difference between what I'm willing to pay and what I actually pay. So here, this, we could think of the next person has a willingness to pay of 18. They're still paying a price of 10. Everyone's paying a price of 10 in this market, and so they get an $8 gain. That would be their consumer surplus. So just that distance between your demand curve and the price, which is the willingness to pay and the price, that is your consumer surplus. So this is just the consumer surplus for the first unit, right? And then the next unit, and again, we could fill in all the gaps here if we wanted to. And we can just keep going, right? So willingness to pay is getting smaller, same price, and so someone is getting a benefit, that consumer surplus, from purchasing this good at $10. They're getting a benefit as long as that willingness to pay is above $10. So we would keep going out to equilibrium here. And so notice as I approach that equilibrium point, someone here, this last buyer is just barely willing to pay above $10. So they're getting a tiny little benefit. Whoever's that last buyer, we would call them the marginal buyer. But in terms of total surplus, that's how we're going to be maximizing the surplus, because now we're selling to every person that has a willingness to pay above $10, and whoever's up here in this part of the demand curve, again, if we think of these as separate people, if someone out there has the absolute highest willingness to pay for that good, they get the most consumer surplus, but then someone else gets a little bit less and a little bit less. And so if we go out to equilibrium, we're going to maximize the total surplus, but in marginal terms, that last person, that marginal buyer, is basically breaking even. So we're going to assume that someone is going to buy this until basically they get zero surplus at that very last unit. So another way of saying that, the price is determined by the marginal buyer here, right at the margin, because it doesn't matter if we put another person up here that has a really high willingness to pay, right? That's not going to affect what's happening here at the price. So the price is still going to be $10, determined by that marginal buyer, and as we'll see, the marginal seller as well. So things are determined at the margin, and we'll see this again over and over again in economics.